Welcome to this rapid revision exam skills session looking at the Edexcel Paper 2, the World Depth Study Question 1, Explain 2 Consequences, worth 8 marks. I'll be focusing on an example from the American West topic, which is what I teach. However, the exam skills that will be covered in this are applicable to any of the topics that you might be looking at, so it could well be useful. Let's have a look at what Paper 2 involves. Let's get a bit of background about the Pearson Edexcel Paper 2. Traditionally, this is split in two. One is a British depth study, and the other is a European or wider world depth study. The topic that I teach is Anglo-Saxon and Norman England circa 1060 to circa 1087, and the American West 1830 to 1895 for the wider world depth study. In the past, these two have been provided with as separate booklets answered within the same exam. For the year 2022 only, though, these exams have been split into two separate, shorter exams, so just be mindful of that. Traditionally, though, the total time for both papers is 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can half that in 2022, as they will be sat separately. Now let's have a look at the question. Before we answer the question, it's really important to consider the instructions that come with it. It's very easy to actually answer the wrong question sometimes, or maybe answer too many or too few, so do read all the instructions very carefully when you're proceeding with the exam. Here it says quite clearly, answer all the questions in this section. Although you have some choice in topic in the very last part, and I'll do a separate video on that, here it's being quite clear that you do need to answer all the questions, so make sure that you do. This first question says, explain 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868. The question is laid out with space to write your answer, labelled consequence 1, and also later on the page it'll say consequence 2. So there's a clear indication of roughly how much you should be writing and definitely where to write it. So let's consider what is required by this particular question. By explaining 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty, you have to consider what comes next. Consequences can be both good and bad, or just something in between. They're just something that happens as a result. For this question, you'll need to explain how examples you know about led to further events or examples. Explaining how one leads to the other is the key. Here's a section from the mark scheme. The target in this question is the analysis of second order concepts, in this case consequence, that's known as AO2 or Assessment Objective 2. Knowledge and understanding of features and characteristics, or Assessment Objective 1, is also marked. Notice that there are 4 marks for AO2 and 4 marks for AO1, so you'll need a roughly equal balance between your knowledge and your explanation of the consequences. Note that the examiner will mark each consequence separately, so it's basically a 2 times 4 mark question. So you want to put equal detail into both parts, as we shall see. Another thing to bear in mind here is to be really careful about what consequences you're going to be writing about. Maybe you could consider what would be the easy mistake to make with this question. There are 2 Fort Laramie treaties in the American West topic, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Be sure to be writing about consequences of the correct treaty. You should aim to spend about 12 minutes on this question, although some candidates might get this done a bit sooner, which will provide a little bit of extra time on the longer questions. Let's consider what the examiner is actually going to be looking for. The level descriptors here are pretty simple, but we'll have a look at the key differences. For level 1, a simple or generalized comment is offered about a consequence. That means that you do actually indicate a consequence or something that happens as a result, but it's pretty general and maybe the knowledge isn't that specific. Whereas on level 2, the features of the period are analysed to explain the consequence. That means that you're explaining how and why the next thing happened as a result of the first thing. Again, we'll see here that in level 1, you are showing limited knowledge and understanding of the period, whereas with level 2, you have specific information about the topic and a good knowledge and understanding of the period. So it's about the quality and depth of your knowledge that you're displaying. So make sure you use specific examples and you choose relevant ones. Again, have a look at how the page is laid out here. The exam paper actually has consequence 1 written here and plenty of space for you to write your answer underneath. Make sure that you write 1 consequence in this space and then use the next bit, labelled consequence 2 predictably enough, to record the next part of your answer, as they'll each be marked separately as we've covered. One of the things I recommend to my students is that they use a structure like point, example, explain and link in their answer. This isn't essential, but it's a good way of making sure that you've included both good knowledge and some explanation of it in relation to the question. So let's have a look at an example and see what you think. Bear in mind, I'm trying to write this realistically as a GCSE answer rather than a degree level answer, so it's not necessarily going to be perfect, but it should be very much good enough. One consequence of the Fort Laramie Treaty was that the Black Hills were granted to the Sioux in perpetuity, which means forever. Alright, that's a very simple point, but it actually really addresses the question. One consequence of it was, and then I give an example. Let's add some detail. The Black Hills were incredibly sacred to the Sioux, and so it was important that they should be left to the Indians when agreeing to peace with the US government after Red Cloud's War. This meant that the relations between the US government and the Plains Indians improved. This was a consequence of the Fort Laramie Treaty, as the purpose of the treaty was to restore peace following Red Cloud's War. So let's just run over that again. I've made a point in relation to the Fort Laramie Treaty and a consequence of it. I've added detailed knowledge. I've explained that that's a change in relations between the US government and the Plains Indians, and saying how that is a result of the Fort Laramie Treaty given its purpose. Point, example, explain, and link. So do I get the marks? Well, there's some AO1 in that first point, some AO2 knowledge in the second, some AO2 in the next, and finally a bit of AO1 and AO2 in the last point. So that would get me 4 out of 4 for this first consequence. Let's see how I get on with the next one. Here we can see the next part of the exam paper, labelled Consequence 2, so make sure you've written in both parts. Again, point, example, explain and link. Let's see how I get on this time. The Fort Laramie Treaty stopped white settlers crossing Indian land. The US government agreed to close the Goodnight Loving Trail that led to gold in Montana. This was important to the Indians. However, the settlers had other routes that they could use, so they still trespassed on Indian land. Well, let's see how I got on with this bit. A bit of AO1 and AO2 here. It is basically a consequence of the Fort Laramie Treaty, although I could have been more specific about this, and I definitely could have been more explicit about the stopping of white settlers travelling across Indian land being as a consequence of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Here's where it starts to go wrong, though. That is incorrect. Yes, the government did agree to close one of the trails, but it was the Bozeman Trail, not the Goodnight Loving Trail, which was a cattle drive north. So that is something that I've got wrong. You wouldn't lose marks for having the wrong information in there, but crucially as well, you won't gain any marks for your AO1 knowledge there either. And yes, that might have been important to the Indians, but because I've got the detail wrong, I'm not going to get any extra credit. However, I will get some credit for this last bit. Saying that the settlers had other routes and so there was a consequence that they carried on using other routes is relevant to the question, and in this case is actually accurate. So it's not a very good section, but it's not a disaster either. It'll get me about half marks. So let's have a look at what I should have done for that. The US government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail. This was key to establishing peace after Red Cloud's War because settlers trespassing on the Bozeman Trail was an important reason Red Cloud went to war. However, other routes to the Montana goldfields existed. The consequence of this was that while relations between some Indians and the government improved, not all Indians agreed to the treaty. For example, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to sign it. I've got some AO1 marks for my knowledge there, AO1 and AO2 marks for the next section, and some AO1 and AO2 marks, especially for that linking sentence, where I really do make it clear that I'm referring to the consequences or results of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And because the knowledge in this case is accurate, that will get me 4 out of 4. Perhaps you want to have a go at this question for yourself. You could always revise what the key terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty were, and I do have a separate rapid revision video on that if you want to go and have a look for it. Alternatively, you could try out some of these. Explain 2 consequences of the Indian Removal Act. Explain 2 consequences of the discovery of gold in California, 1848 to 1849. Explain 2 consequences of the Homestead Act, 1862. Explain 2 consequences of the Transcontinental Railroad. And explain 2 consequences of the destruction of the buffalo. You could refer to the mark schemes again to make sure that you're going to be covering enough and you're going to be covering the right sort of things. One further thing to notice, unlike some of the other questions, like the 12 mark and 16 mark questions, you don't get any stimulus points with these. You're simply expected to have the knowledge for yourself. Anyway, if you're one of my students, we are actually looking at the American West, so you'll want to pause the video here and maybe have a go at one of those questions. If you're not, and you're looking at a different topic, you might want to watch on, and I've got some other examples for other topics which are covered under the same exam board. If you're studying Spain and the New World, you could try this one out. explain 2 consequences of the New Laws, 1542. If you're studying British America, explain 2 consequences of the French and Indian War for the American colonists in the years 1754 to 63. And if you're studying superpower relations, explain 2 consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Okay, good luck with those, but remember, although I've been talking mostly about the American West, the mark scheme is the same, and the way that you get those marks for the assessment objectives is also identical. Some final points. 8-mark explain 2 consequences questions rely on secure knowledge and the ability to explain how one thing causes another. You will need specific knowledge, so be careful that you read the issue and the question carefully, e.g. the Fort Laramie Treaty, well which one, 1851 or 1868? You'll need to explain what happened as a result. This is what a consequence is. It could be good, bad or neither. And that is the last point. Consequences can be positive, negative, neither. It's just what happens as a result. I hope that's been useful to you. If it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you need further tips, you could always pop them in the comments below and I'll see if I can reply to you. And if you're preparing for an exam, the very best of luck. I'm sure you'll absolutely nail it. Anyway, that's all from me for now. Thanks very much for watching and goodbye.